Okay, thank you very much. So, like Igor, I have a lot of slides, so we'll see how much I get through, but we'll see how it goes. So, I'm mostly a sculptor. I work in a lot of different media. This is a cyanotype. Use this technique for specimens, so it has a nice kind of historical correlation. So this is my favorite tree. This is Old Tico in Sweden in the Via National Park. So I was able to visit and photograph as well as 3D scan. Um, and so I do a lot of different methods. I'm not always able to go as an artist and sample or do anything like that. When I can, I actually bring clay with me and I take molds of trees and things like that. But in a lot of cases, it's not appropriate or I'm not allowed. And so photography is a main form of documentation that then I use to work sculpturally. So Old Tico is a clonal tree, which means the tree that you saw above the surface is actually only, started to become a tree probably in the 40s, but it's on a mesa and normally the trees grow up and the snow pushes it back down. And so, I'm very interested in dendrochronology and the science and the validity of all the trees that I work with. So I love that the fact that really what you see is very new and what is hidden from you really holds that history. But researchers were able to carbon date this tree by reaching underneath and collecting old wood that had died and just been protected. So this tree was dated to 9,550 approximately years old. So 3D scanning is a big technique that I use. It's called photogrammetry, where I take lots of pictures and I can use a software that mathematically stitches it together. And so normally I take off all this beautiful imagery. I can rotate these in 3 dimensions and see the form, and I take off the pictures and you're looking at the shapes and the form and I can deal with that. But there's always this moment you see something like this. So things are scattered and stitched, and you kind of get this beautiful stretching of imagery that can happen across the surface. So I've traveled to Scandinavia and Europe a couple times to visit mostly specific trees. But in one case, I was able to go to the Białowieża forest in Poland, to the Białowieża National Park. And this is this beautiful gate that they have. The forest is protected. It's a primeval forest that consists of old growth that theoretically has been kind of unmanaged and untouched. And this view right here is outside the park, and there's a huge contrast between the landscape outside this protected area and then inside. Outside the park, trees have been cleared, and where you do see trees, like on the right here, they're all tend to be monoculture species. Here we have some kind of maybe birch, and then a little bit past that, we have conifers. So it's a very different feeling once you enter the park, where you get something that trees of all different ages, kind of a feature of this forest is all the dead wood that's continually decaying, all the fungus. It is quite unmanaged. And I say mostly, areas of this forest have been logged, but they've really tried to protect this area, and you can only enter it with a guide. So it is limited as much as they can with people. So I was able to have a dendrochronologist take me in for a few hours. And it was interesting because he was kind of telling me they always find people trying to live in the wild in this forest. So, it's, even though it's meant to be left alone and really become as natural as it can be, there is still quite a bit of human interaction. And so thinking about the whole forest, I was really struck by this idea of decay. So I created this piece called Boundary Layer. And to create it, I actually built the tree in my studio. What that I was able to do in this forest was lay clay on the surface. So I use molds, rubber molds that I'm able to cast directly, bark textures and get as much realism as I can. And I use those to rebuild. And then I in theory, let the tree fall and then let it decay. So I'm paralleling that process that would happen in the forest, you know, as much as I can here with water, letting the clay dissolve. And then firing it. So here's another view, and I'm using ceramic materials and lots of processes to kind of recreate this kind of feeling of this decay and this kind of unmanaged, you know, in a way, kind of natural process. So digital technologies like 3D scanning that I mentioned are also used. You know, it's a way to see a form, to capture its surfaces and its detail. And so I've done that in the back with a mold of a cross section of a cut tree, but then I've also done 3D scanning and 3D printing. And so these were, I did this at Gulyago, which is a ceramic residency in Denmark. And so I scanned logs. These were cast-offs of hardwood. So a lot of bark, just a little bit of wood sold as firewood. And so I was recreating the structure of the tree. So they were 3D scanned and then 3D printed. And a lot of people are familiar with 3D printing as far as plastic goes. Plastic is melted and it comes out melted in these small little coils and builds up very much like tree rings through layering. And so what I do as a ceramic artist is I work with a paste porcelain. So basically I soften down my clay. This is a 3D printer that I built, and I'm extruding, allowing the machine to guide the layers in a really controlled way, but it's squishing out this soft porcelain and building it up layer by layer. And I really am drawn to this technique because of its parallel with tree ring growth and dendrochronology itself. In Denmark, where I did my residency, I was able to visit Kongigen, if I'm pronouncing that right. It's the royal oak. And so this one, they can't date it exactly because most of it's rotted out. It's an oak tree, but it's maybe culturally, historically dated at about 1,500 years old. And so it's still living. It was very large, and one side of it is rotted out. So it's kind of this small shell. It's in a very dense forest, as you can see. But in this case, I was given permission. It's fenced in. I was given permission to get inside the perimeter, get very close, lay clay on the surface, scan it, really investigate the tree in many different ways. And so piece I created, this was 3D printed. This is a scan of what is left of the tree, but turned up on the side. So you can see kind of the fragility of this shell, negative and positive space. Another work this is 3D printed in porcelain. You know, it was a very dense forest. So getting up close to it, you know, it's an extremely large tree. So you're seeing kind of small sections at a time. You know, your view is just a portion of the tree. And so I was kind of playing with that idea, working with sections of the scans and putting them together so your eye can kind of fill in the void and you know, connect the pieces together. And so this is shown with, oh, there's a detail of that. So you could see it's kind of pulled out and extruded to get the contours and the height. But another piece, this is symbolizing the interior of the tree that is dead and starting to decay and rot from the center out, creating the interior side of this shell. And this was 3D printed, but a different technique using powder. And so this is salt and charcoal. And so that's something we'll see later on in the images, but I'm very interested in salt as a symbol for preservation, and then charcoal relating to not only fires, but this idea of K and the element of carbon, which would be left behind. So quick little video. This process is a little different. It's a powder. I've kind of hacked a machine. I'm using sake as the liquid that's printing, just like ink would print on a piece of paper. And then another layer brings a new layer of salt. So it's very, very fine. You don't always see the layering that happens. So once I'm finished, I mine the object out of the powder. So the loose powder can act as the support. And so I can put different materials into this machine and print, but salt and charcoal seems to be my preferred at the moment. Sorry. Switching over to the US, this is Kings Canyon. So this is in California. These are sequoia trees, which are very similar to redwoods. So this is Chicago stump. So I was looking for the oldest trees. That really is something that I'm very interested. Trees with names, trees that are dendrochronology. I can never print dated for dendrochronological methods, so that I really know kind of a factual year. So these trees are very large. This is part of an area called Converse Grove, where it was logged in the kind of late 1800s, and there have been several fires. And fire is very important to sequoias in that they're very resistant to fire, but they need fire to open up their cones and to propagate new trees. This actually was cut down in the 1800s and shipped off to the Chicago World's Fair, where everybody believed it was a hoax. So it had kind of this interesting life. And these trees were logged mostly for, it's kind of a brittle wood, so fence post, matchsticks, grape stakes, kind of, very disposable wood. So I worked with some researchers at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research to find the locations of very specific trees that were the oldest, even older than the previous one, Chicago stump. So, and this is a nice kind of example where size doesn't always mean age. These are complacent trees, as Igor was mentioning. Some trees have constraints, harder living conditions. In this area, these were more complacent, so they grow quite big, but size doesn't always equal age. So this is CBR 26, and this is the oldest dated sequoia. There could be many that are older, but since the trees are so large, they're very difficult to date with a core sample. So they were able to, since these were already logged, samples were taken from the top, a wedge was cut out and dated. So this tree was dated to, I think, 3,266 years old. And so I laid clay on the surface as well as 3D scanned. And so this piece is 3D printed with charcoal and salt. So again, the salt for preservation and charcoal referring to the importance of fire in this landscape. And then certainly, fire is creating these kind of amazing textures and revealing all the different layers and often layers of rings that you can see in the surface. So kind of a series of different vignettes kind of symbolizing the idea of this Converse Grove being really a field of stumps at this point. And so here's a detail that you can see some of in the side view, some of the, there's some just really beautiful surfaces. Igor commented on, how beautiful some of these folds and rings and things that can happen in the trees visually. And so I've exhibited it together with the log I showed earlier from Białowieża forest in Poland. That's just a different one. About a little over a year ago, I was able to visit the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research in Tucson, Arizona. And Tucson, Arizona is a desert climate. It's the home of the Saguaro National Park. So saguaro are large cactuses. So it's really not known for trees, but this was kind of the birthplace of dendrochronology. And so it was very interesting to visit this site, speak with researchers and learn more about their library. Here they called them cookies, all these slabs, they collect them from other institutions. But they were very generous and gave me kind of full reign of their site. And I was able to speak with researchers that did the work specifically on some of the trees that I had visited. So here we have that same tree, CBR 26, that I was working with. And we have we can see that the center of the tree was dated to 1380 BC. And then, as Igor was talking about here on the left, we have a really quite beautiful fire scar in there. But I mentioned it was an astronomer that developed this. A.E. Douglas was looking for evidence of the solar cycle in things that, recorded information annually like trees. And so through looking for that, he started to develop more of a chronology and was able to date a lot of the ruins in the Southwest and really developed the field. So this is another piece, same tree, CBR 26, that I completed after that visit, really thinking about tree rings as a whole. So this kind of has a pattern of tree rings in how it was assembled together. A lot of the processes that I do, I'm limited by scale, 3D printers. I can't print something usually larger than a foot. And so I usually make lots of parts and assemble to get something that can somehow equate to the scale of something like a sequoia. One of the great things was getting to dig through the archives, and they had, all these wonderful lantern slides from the 1800s. Lantern slides are old glass slides. And so this is another tree that I was specifically looking at called D21. So this is an early, probably from the 1900s, and I could see a little closer image of it, but there's that stump. That the landscape looked quite a bit different when I was searching for it. I was looking at maps and GPS and things like that to try to find the one. But I think it's interesting kind of showing how long ago this forest was impacted and then the science that can be done. So this is what D21 looks like now. Successive fires have gone through and burned this area. But again, I was able to hunt it down, which is always kind of the thrill of field research, and then scan and work with it. I was also able to dig through and have the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research pull out samples from their collection. So this is that wedge-shaped cut that was able to be cut straight through the center of the tree since it was already cut down. So again, sequoias are so huge, you really can't use an incremental bore to take a little slice out. So having the tree already sliced, they could cut that large wedge from the top and then do the dendrochronology, the research on the rings. So I scanned these. And then recently I created a piece based on those. And so again, I'm using 3D printing as a way to, that's a overall shot. 3D printing as a way to really kind of mimic all the layers of early wood and late wood and show sculpturally the idea of the rings across this form. I'm very interested in this being a library of information and how important repetition and, the striations and what information they can hold. Igor, before we started talking, talked about he was interested in the future of fires. This was a piece where I scanned, I would say, maybe a younger sequoia. It looked a little less scarred and fire burned than some of the others. Obviously, it was still living. It wasn't cut. So I 3D scanned it. That's what the inner shell is. And then I was working sculpturally to layer it and take it into the future. And so this is something I'm going to begin a series of these where I start thinking about the future of these trees as opposed to always looking towards the past. Lately, I've been doing a lot of research with aspens. So I'm from Colorado in the United States, right outside Denver, which is right outside the Rocky Mountains. And I've traveled to other aspen forests, but aspens are really, they really carry the mark of the landscape. And so this was just a really fun one that I found, and it's mostly snow that pushes things down when they're young and allow them to grow in these kind of crazy shapes. But Pando is an aspen colony. Again, like Old Tico, the first slide I showed, this is a clonal aspen colony. So what you see above the surface is fairly young. Aspens live about 100, 130 years, maybe on the top end. But this aspen colony spans about 106 acres and is dated. Nobody can say exactly because it can't be carbon dated or dated through dendrochronology, but through climate modeling and fossil records, it's estimated to be about 8 to 12,000 years ago. So going back to the most recent ice age. And it's considered the largest tree by weight. It's about 13 million pounds. And so what is interesting about this is it's one organism and it's just sending up clones. But from this picture, you'll see everything is almost the same age. All the trees look the same. There's no young growth. And so that's an issue. Pando is really suffering the effects of climate change. Deer are coming in and eating all the young growth. They allow cattle. I was just there about a week ago and it's gotten very popular. So it was kind of full of visitors, but they've started fencing areas off to try to preserve it. This is again a 3D scan that I did of this. So I've been creating these collages where I start to show some of the imagery. So again, kind of symbolizing that Pando is starting, it's dying, and a lot of people don't know why. It's subject to disease. Not so much fire in this case. In fact, fire is one of the reasons that they believe that it is dying. And so they've started to go in, like I said, and fence areas off. You can see this is a fenced area, so quite different from the earlier image where there were no young trees growing in the fenced off areas, protecting it from animals. Then it's able to grow young shoots. Also, fire clearing out some of those conifer bushes and things that overtake it. So fire, disease management, and even just physical barriers are things that are happening in this forest right now. So over the period of probably 4 years, when I'm going through Utah, I try to stop by and visit this forest and 3D scan. It's composed of about, they estimate 40,000 individual trees, give or take. But so I'm scanning these and then 3D printing them, eventually creating, a complete forest. And so these aren't vessels, they're open at the bottom. They're very thin, translucent porcelain, so they kind of glow, kind of a golden yellow. But the bummer thing about Zoom is I discovered I usually don't zoom and then look how it comes across, but in my image, I can see all the individual very fine layers. So I know it's a little less detailed on your end, but again, that 3D printing, doing very slow over time, building up through layers. I'm very interested in that correlation. Normally when I've gone there, I look just at the trees. I'm looking at the forest, you kind of block out all the human interactions and things that you see. But recently, I was struck by this date. So on the right, I can't read what's on the top, but it's September 3rd, 1935. And so I was really struck by, what was happening in the forest with humans, how they were making their mark on the landscape. Why would they be making their marks on the landscape? These are, traditionally a very remote area. But humans do want to somehow have this connection to trees. And so I started digging in a little deeper on the idea of what are called arbor glyphs. So they're called arbor glyphs and they're protected when they're old, and they're considered graffiti and vandalism when they're new. And I find that kind of interesting. Where is something kind of culturally significant? And then where does it become a nuisance? So this is a collection of pieces where I'm taking kind of really old, maybe historical tree carvings and contrasting them with some of the newer kind of graffiti type things to talk about that, where is that line that something is important, and then it is not. So I know a lot of in different forests, even the Park Service and the Forest Service are cataloging and doing kind of the research and the history on these trees, although obviously they discourage anybody from doing this to trees now. A lot of this arbor glyphs, this is my son, this was southern Colorado. There were a lot of Basque and Peruvian sheep herders in this area. And so they spending, 4 or 5 months in the high country, these aspen groves grow usually above 9,000 feet. And, taking respite, watching their flock, and, kind of marking their presence in the landscape, not really for a viewer, but more for themselves. So this was one. I can find not only dates and language, sometimes it's the same people over successive years. So you see a date of the 30s and then maybe one again in the 80s. But again, these are remote locations. Here we have a horse. So I've kind of been traveling wherever I can and scanning and cataloging these, because obviously most of these trees are kind of at the end of their life. So this imagery is fading. So this was, it's called the Aspen Archive. So I worked with a professor at my university who was, she's in the language department, and she was really unpacking the history of sheep herding in Colorado and Utah, kind of the Western region. And so this collection is aspens mixed in with prints of the arbor glyphs. Check my time. These are bristlecones. So aspens, sequoias, and bristlecones really kind of have been my focus. So bristlecone pines are very constrained trees. They grow in very rough climates. They grow on these very rocky, often limestone hillsides, a lot of wind and weather, and they grow very slowly. So this kind of landscape protects them from fire, and they produce a lot of resin. So their tree rings are very, very small. They grow very dense. And even though a tree might look completely dead like this, it can have one little strip of cambium maybe on the back side, and it can still be living. And so this area doesn't decay very much either. So when a tree does die and fall, that dead wood just lies there. And so researchers can go in and collect, and the tree ring record goes back. There's a few holes, but it can go back about 9,000 years on the bristlecones. So Methuselah, I tried very hard to find this particular tree, but sadly, because of vandals and who knows who, this tree is inaccessible to me as an artist. But Methuselah was dated to 5,458 years. It's older even now. It is still growing, but it is, you can get to the forest, but you can't access the actual tree. And so this is a very old core from the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research that shows the ring pattern, and it's sitting on top of the oldest sequoia that's ever been dated, which is called Prometheus. So I visited the grove where Methuselah grew and tried very hard and searched for tree ring tags in the hope that I could possibly maybe find something, because I really was interested in trying to scan the tree. But this is again a cyanotype, and paired with it is a sample cast from the surface of one of the trees. Maybe the one, I will never know. Kind of opposite in the landscape, kind of the Great Basin area, the bristlecones in California are on one side of the Great Basin, and towards the other is Great Basin National Park. And so this is another grove that's been studied, and this is where Prometheus lives. So this is the oldest dated bristlecone, but it was unfortunately cut down. That's how they realized it was so old. So here's a sample on the left of, although it looks quite dead, it does have a small strip of cambium, so it is still living. So they grow very, very slowly, and they do create, because of their very harsh conditions, these very interesting, twisted, dense, worn shapes. So they're quite sculptural. The location of this is, there's a glacial cirque. It's the last glacier left in Nevada. It's called a rock glacier. And I've always found a great correlation between glaciers and trees, because both of them do hold information in layers on an annular basis. But I was able to get the GPS coordinates from the national park and hike off trail. It was quite an adventure across this glacial moraine. The tree is just to my left of this image, and I'm looking up into the glacier. So Prometheus was a tree that was cut down in 1964 by a grad student who was not a dendrochronologist, but story goes his borer got stuck in the wood, and then was asked and was given permission to be able to cut the tree down and retrieve his tool, as well as take samples. And so it was only after they were able to evaluate the wood samples that they discovered that this was the oldest one they'd ever found. So this is not available to the public. Research is still ongoing on this one, and it's kind of kept a secret because it is, the oldest bristlecone wood that they have been able to find. And so I was able to visit the stump and what remained of this. And so you can see a large wedge has been cut out of here. There's been lots of evidence of study. And so here's the stump. My tiny backpack there in the corner. Difficult to photograph. I was there in the middle of the day with harsh lighting, and after quite a long and treacherous hike, actually. So again, like I mentioned, I'm very interested in the correlation between glaciers and trees. So this is that glacial cirque. If you were looking at it not through Zoom, there is a little bit more detail, but I'm taking the image and working with it sculpturally to create what's called a height field, which is a low relief, and I'm casting it in salt. And this was salt that was collected from the Great Basin, which was an area that was once an ancient lake. It is dried up, and so there's all these salt deposits in the area. So I was able to collect the salt and then cast that surface. So this is kind of a sculptural freehand version of even what the materials that I use. Just taking that outside, working with molds to get the scale. And then I was able to 3D print. In this case, I 3D printed all the parts in plastic to try to get something larger. So this is about 2.5 feet across. Certainly not the actual scale of Prometheus. The Prometheus stump is probably about 8 feet across. And then it got larger from there. But making a mold of this and then casting this in clay so that I could get one large object. And in person, all the detail of the cuts and the tree rings and the cracks, kind of time and layering and tool do show in the surface when you can see it in person. And so this is exhibited where you see that salt image of that cirque where that rock glacier is, kind of showing the location and the conditions of the site. I did a residency in Svalbard in the Arctic Circle. The name of the residency is called the Arctic Circle, and I'm returning there again next August. But while I was there, I'm 3D scanning all different kinds of things, and in here, ice, glaciers as much as I can. But I did create a piece, and I'll make the connection here more in a minute, but I rebuilt the glaciers that I scanned. And then in this piece, this was an outdoor installation. It was all coated white. And then one of the things with the forest fires, we had huge ones in Canada that impacted, I know, the air quality where I lived quite a bit all summer. But all of that pollution, that charcoal, that carbon lands on the ice and darkens it. And so it affects something called the albedo effect. And so albedo is the measure of reflectance. And so that's something incredibly important for our climate, that the poles are reflecting heat and light. But with forest fires and things happening, that ice turns dark, it absorbs more and then begins to melt, and it helps furthers that melting. And so in this case, I'm kind of collaborating with the climate here in Colorado, and that surface over time starts to wear away by wind and snow. I have this piece, kind of a second version, on display at the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art. This piece is right by a stream, so I couldn't have it actually wear live with the weather. I had to do that in my studio and then fire it again so that it was fixed. So this piece doesn't change with the weather, but it still kind of shows this idea of melting and revealing, and its relationship to other landscapes. So back to Svalbard and my interest in ice, I really was struck. It kind of, things came full circle for me, because I'm hiking on a glacial moraine and it's covered in fossils. Fossils of all different kinds of different leaves, which was really amazing to see, that a landscape that grows no trees now at one point was covered in a forest. And then through glaciation and retreat, we're able to reveal this past history. And even here is a big petrified piece of wood that I was able to find. There was one site we were hiking up on the edge of the glacier, and there was just all kinds of bits of wood, and you could see, you know, bark and rings and things like that in the surface. And then to end, this is something, you know, thinking more about the deep, deep past of geological time. Sequoias are also types of redwoods, used to cover a much larger portion of North America than they do now. Now they're kind of limited to California and Oregon coasts. But here in Colorado, we have an area. This was, these were sequoias that were buried, and it is a video so we can see. It was a main tree that, as it started to die, the main tree would have been growing in the center, and it was sending up new shoots. And so that's why this is called a trio. And so these are the new shoots. And it was buried by a lava flow about 33 plus million years ago. And so it fossilized the stumps. These are about 6 feet tall. And so the Park Service, I didn't do this scan. They actually did that as part of their research methods, but they were able to give me access to this. So this is kind of something that I'm figuring out how to work with this and trying to find an exhibition site for something that I believe in the end will, my interpretation of it will be quite large, but we'll see. And there we go. That's the end of my talk.